The problem with spam is that it increases transaction fees for monetary users. I would argue that that's actually a good thing for Bitcoin to drive people away who don't want to use it for monetary purposes. You want to have rules on the database for how it's structured. It makes sense to not only get rid of op return, but then go further and limit the size of inputs. I just think it's completely irrelevant to Bitcoin's mission of being a monetary system.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian here, welcoming you to another great episode of Supply Shock. We've got a first today, a historic first, our first returning guest. We've got Pierre Rochard, founder of the Bitcoin Bond Company, chief of the audit committee at Strive, host of the Bitcoin for Corporations podcast, and founder of the prestigious Nakamoto Institute, one of the best resources to learn about Bitcoin on planet Earth and the internet. Pierre, excited to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Pete.
So Pierre, you hit me with something provocative. We've been discussing this Bitcoin core versus Bitcoin knots debate. Really, a deep analysis of what the forward policy should be of the Bitcoin software, what the expectations of the users are. It's really cutting across all corners. I wanted to start with your contention that essentially the op return, this is the annex within the Bitcoin core software where arbitrary data is supposed to live. You can quibble with a lot of those words, but your contention is that it needs to be removed. This was a feature of the software added in 2014, and that this would help maybe quell the competing forces of the debate. Maybe we can start there and share a little bit about the op return. Essentially my understanding was that according to Bitcoin Core here, op return was a feature in the Bitcoin software 0.9. Was not an endorsement of storing data in the blockchain. The op return creates a provably prunable output to avoid data storage schemes, some of which were already deployed at the time of its passing. So op return, why turn the focus to op return?
Yeah, okay. Well, so there's been a longstanding debate in the wider crypto community that essentially pits the utility thesis against the scarcity thesis. And so the utility thesis is we'll generate demand for the native asset, in this case, Bitcoin, and we're going to do that by providing features that people want in a decentralized system. So Vitalik's World Computer, Solana, these are, to me, like the utility thesis. And then the scarcity thesis is really the monetary maximalist position that the only reason why any of these things have any value at all is just as a monetary instrument that has scarcity. And Bitcoin is a one-time invention of scarcity. And so that's, we don't need fancy features. We don't need JPEGs on the blockchain. It's going to continue to grow in adoption and value without needing to change the software, right? So even, going so far as to talking about ossification and things like that. So I think that the op return feature within Bitcoin really illustrates the debate between these two camps, and that if you go back far enough, you see that Vitalik used it as a reason to launch Ethereum. Was that the bickering over the op return was a signal to him that the Bitcoin ecosystem would not really be friendly towards what he was trying to accomplish with in terms of creating a world computer with lots of features, and that essentially drove him away. And I would argue that that's actually a good thing. It's actually a good thing for Bitcoin to drive people away who don't want to use it for monetary purposes. What it's designed for, from my perspective, and it's good for Ethereum, right? Which is that he actually got maximum freedom to do exactly what he wanted to do and didn't have to constantly engage in political bickering with people who disagree with him. So Now, today, there's kind of been a massive sea change in ethos, it seems like. We can trace it maybe back to ordinals, with Casey coming out with this way of labeling sats using kind of a secondary software on top of Bitcoin. And that also having the relaxation of past data usage limits on inputs. And so this allowed for inscriptions, very large inscriptions that use the kind of unconstrained rules of Taproot. That was a soft fork, fairly recent. And that it has unleashed mayhem ideologically within the Bitcoin camp, because I think it comes down to how flexible do we want Bitcoin to be going forward. So the argument put forward against limiting the size of Taproot inputs, that is an argument that Andrew Polstra put forward in the mailing list, was that we might need that room later. So don't close the door here when we might have some really interesting monetary use cases for that size, right? You could point to, for example, it might be necessary for post-quantum cryptography, right? We might need to have that amount of data to do something very secure, or ZK rollups, proofs, all these things that could be interesting from a monetary perspective.
Well, maybe I just slightly changed it. Say, resource constraint. Maybe we would want to, put more transactions onto Bitcoin, right? Isn't that ultimately about making the blockchain more efficient?
Right. The problem is that in the meantime, it's being spammed. And so it's had a lot of different kind of meta protocols that have emerged, of people trading back and forth, whether it's NFTs or BRC20 tokens and the like, things that Bitcoiners really don't like, because they've always only emerged on Ethereum. And so we've always, had the kind of white blood cell immune reaction to all these things as just things Bitcoin doesn't need, and in fact make Ethereum worse, right? And so now we were kind of put into a position of needing to reject something that was on our blockchain. All that to say that if we take it for granted that Andrew's right and that we should not reduce the size of inputs, then it kind of completely changes the ethos that the core research community and developers have had around spam mitigation. And so then when we look at OpReturn, for example, OpReturn gives us an opportunity to try to get people to use a less harmful way of spamming Bitcoin than the Taproot inputs. And so I think that essentially conceding that first point about Taproot inputs really opened up Pandora's box in changing the ethos and the philosophy of how to fight spam on Bitcoin. And I think that that's really what has caused so much maybe negative energy within the Knots camp towards.
Can we stick on that point for a second, though? Because the change here in culture is alleged from a non-change, right? This is kind of one of the things that I'll always say is one of the most defensible points of ordinals and these additional meta protocols is that unlike in the past with Ethereum and these other alternative cryptocurrencies that wanted lots of changes, this wave of meta protocols actually worked within the confines of Bitcoin. So a bit of a culture change there, right? Where they're not asking for changes specifically. And in the case of, Casey Rochard, I think, he built that protocol with a lot of design intent, but you're saying essentially, in terms of
with the Taproot upgrade, it did not have that same limit on input sizes that SegWit had. And so, and deliberately so to kind of keep things open-minded, right, going forward for future potential uses of that space. But it immediately, I think, changed kind of the dialogue around spam of, well, if we're not going to close that door, then we should open up other doors. And specifically, right, if we look at OpReturn, the size limit on OpReturn, there's two of them, One is the consensus rule, which I think is 100,000 bytes. So it's pretty sizable. And by the way, that's bigger than like any other kind of output, right? So it's kind of, from a consensus rules perspective, already kind of doing its own thing. Then if we look at the mempool relay policies, which everybody has on their own node, they can kind of do whatever they want with that. But historically, that's kind of where the contention has been about what number should be on that relay policy. And that is very influential in terms of what ends up getting mined. And so, to my knowledge, there has not been, and correct me, Bitcoin historian, an op return that hits the consensus limit. I'm
not aware of any. Yeah.
Is the full size that it can be. And I think that, part of the reason why that hasn't happened is because the limit on mempool relay policy has tamped down on the possibility of that happening. What Core wants to do in terms of removing the mempool limit entirely, I think it would increase the probability of a full size op return making it into Bitcoin.
Right, but their argument is that's desired because it would be ultimately less data than currently.
Well, it's prunable from the UTXO set, so op returns are provably unspendable, and so you can stop tracking them after you've kind of verified them. But that assumes that we're going to be able to change the behavior of the people who are using inscriptions and ordinals and kind of the meta protocols there, which is dubious. But it also, I think, essentially makes it like more convenient and less expensive to be able to spam. And I think that's just the wrong direction to be going in. I think that ultimately, if we want to, the problem with spam is that it increases transaction fees for monetary users, and it increases...
I've never really heard a great explanation of why that's a particular problem, though, because monetary users should have the expectation that the costs are going to advance enough for blocks to be full, correct?
Yeah, but the software should not optimize for that outcome, because ultimately, I think the software exists to serve the monetary users, and to do that in their best interests, the software really should have a anti-spam tilt to it. This, if we think about like Bitcoin being a database, you want to have rules on the database for how it's structured, so that it is optimized for the application. In this case, being a ledger, and so that's where I think that it makes sense to not only get rid of op return, but then go further and limit the size of inputs, and of obviously of Taproot inputs specifically, and that basically make it more expensive to spam per byte than it currently is. And that if we keep going in that direction, then I don't think it's like a slippery slope. People are like, oh, how do we, if it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? That we're going to fix one spam vector and then another one will come up. I just don't think that's the case. I think that there was not a spam vector before Taproot that was so inexpensive, and that it's always going to be at the margins. But I don't think that there's going to be a kind of whack-a-mole effect here.
Well, I mean, let's go back to the days of the op return. Maybe I'd add a little color to your first description, right? Like there was a hope that, my understanding of looking at the developer conversations from that time is that they wanted to accommodate different meta protocols on Bitcoin and layer twos, right? Like depending on how you want to think about that. But essentially, the reason for the 40, is a kilobyte limit, whatever, our original, what's the specific, is it 40 kilobyte? What's the
40 bytes?
40 bytes. Okay.
Yeah.
So the 40 byte limit and then the 80 byte limit was eventually, it was the expectation that people would hash data and that other protocols would hash data into Bitcoin, right? That is how we ended up with op return, right? And it was a sort of assumed within the design structure that additional layers would need the support. You don't think that there's been sufficient evidence to prove that after 10 years?
Well, I don't even think it has any value. So like if let's say there was a system that was anchored in Bitcoin, like open timestamps, okay, that was using op return, and that all of the world's governments were relying on it, all the financial institutions were relying on it to timestamp all sorts of different, documents and things, or videos to prevent deep fakes or whatever it is. That I don't think it is Bitcoin's obligation to provide value for that. To from my perspective, that is just it's parasitic, and so cutting it off is not at all it's only tolerated by Bitcoin.
Elton Tom timestamps is a parasitic protocol.
Yeah, I do, and I'm sure that I'll win some friends with Peter Todd here. But look, I just think it's completely irrelevant to Bitcoin's mission of being a monetary system.
Right. But I guess how do you, so in the case of, and this is always what I feel like is the poorly argued counter defense to this, which is that, Peter Todd and Casey Rodarmor, like as authors of software, they're authoring software that works, alongside the current Bitcoin rules. And if someone is able to invent something, that uses the Bitcoin software as is in a certain way, to what extent should they have a reasonable, assertion that software will continue to function in perpetuity, right? So with Peter Todd and open timestamps, right, it's like he's designed this additional software. It's compatible with Bitcoin as it's currently designed. Who has the power to then, make the determination that you're making?
So first of all, I actually think that is the strongest argument against soft forking out op return, which is maintaining forwards and backwards compatibility, right? So I think that there is a high threshold to meet there. I think that at the end of the day, if it's not, if your protocol isn't actually being enforced by the semantics of the Bitcoin scripting language, then there should be no expectation of Bitcoin developers catering to that. And so, if you look at, for example, Lightning, right? So why should we not get rid of CLTV or CSV or, any other kind of feature that Lightning relies on? Well, because Lightning is actually using those features for monetary purposes, and is, it's part of the fallback mechanism. And when I look at ordinals or I look at op return, that's not the case, right? So it's all of the semantics are enforced by external, validators or whatever you want to call them.
Right. So you're saying that, but again, like who makes the determination as you've just made it that, that this is the case and then enforces that, right? Because isn't that, everybody keeps invoking that, it's the permissionless nature of Bitcoin and there is an open system and, there isn't an ability to gatekeep people from doing things. So
it's an open monetary system, right? It's not an open system per se. And so I think that them having misaligned expectations of, hey, this is Ethereum that I'm building on, and then they get rugged by a change in the feature set that removes the thing that had no monetary use. I mean, that's just a cell phone. I don't think that I do think that it establishes a higher threshold for what harms do we have to point to before it's a serious conversation. I think that's actually very debatable where,
well, but that's what makes that's one of the reasons why this conversation has struck me as a little bit disingenuous is the time to be outraged about the use of these protocols, the data would have seemed to be a year and a half ago when the entire blockchain was completely full of that,
I think it's just going to keep coming back. I think that this debate is far from over, and it's going to keep coming back in a way that maybe even the block size limit debate could not at this point.
Well, I don't understand. You're the king of flipping Bitcoin's negatives into positives, and so how I would think through this is Bitcoin seemed to have cleared an immense amount of arbitrary data pretty effectively for a very large community of people who wanted different things, and for a certain time were well served by that. And so I've been very confused by the Bitcoin community's inability to see the positivity of it, because I don't really understand the negative parts
Look,
of it.
the only the positivity of it here is that hard drives keep getting less expensive, and so this is we're going to do great with the 4 million weight unit limit, and that that's the only thing saving us at this point is the the weight limit, because everything else is like the social layer, mempool relay policy. I think that Peter Todd's Libra relay just completely moots the debate about mempool policy, and so I think that the debate really should be about consensus rules, and that even if
well, maybe let's stick on that point, because I think it's an interesting one, right? It basically suggests that like within a permissionless network, any small, as long as there's as long as there's a member of each party that's like and the smallest person can be one or two people that are willing to accommodate that. I mean, that's pretty powerful, right? It says that Bitcoin is pretty resistant to attempts to stop unwanted transactions, right?
Yeah, it is, and I think that
that's positive.
Well, you know what? I'd say that it's paradoxical that its censorship resistance is what but it's not about the cost of spam, right? Because basically, it's the misusing Bitcoin being more expensive than using it correctly is not a form of censorship from my perspective, and so I think that it's fine to increase the cost of it. It would be impossible to stop it altogether, right? And so there's going to be ways to stenography of stealthily putting in data into the blockchain. It's just, as long as it's extremely expensive to do and more expensive than using it correctly, then I don't really see an economic problem. I also don't see an existential problem as is, right? I think this is where I disagree with Luke Dasher quite strongly. Is that,
well, so what do you think the removal of op-return does for all the parties here? So how does this improve the vantage point of the debate? Because I think from the standpoint of the folks who are building in these areas, with the meta protocols, right, they're going to keep using the inscriptions envelope, they're going to keep using stamps. They don't really seem altogether too interested in op-return. The core developers obviously want to change that. We talked to Merch last week, and he said, that's the garbage bin. We should make the garbage bin more attractive. Why not try that? Even if you're coming from your position of the you want to mitigate this activity, why not make the attempt to use op-return to mitigate it?
The idea that because you can remove it from the UTXO set and then prune that and then not have to keep it in memory in RAM, I think that the fallacy there from my perspective is that it's not that expensive to get it from disk. Meaning that if you had the whole UTXO set on your hard drive and you're getting a block every 10 minutes, it's really not a constraint to have to update it on disk and not use RAM. So I don't buy the argument that it is harm reduction. And two is that we should also decrease the size limit for inputs. And so it's like, yeah, I would go further and say, hey, let's also constrain the Taproot inputs and have kind of a spam, soft fork that does both at the same time.
Right. So a consensus level push for there to be a cleanup here. But obviously you wouldn't want the core developers, spearheading such an initiative.
Look, if they want to, that's fine. I also I think that
one of the big parts of the block size wars that I think is really glossed over here is that there was a huge amount of the core developers seeking to be perceived as if they were not the arbiters of how Bitcoin is used, right? So you can probably appreciate that from the Knots camp and the demands that they're particularly making of Bitcoin Core. Were Bitcoin Core to answer them, would seem to go a long way towards, these sort of arguments that, and Pierre Todd himself was, really, I think, the architect of this, whole worldview, is that that Bitcoin Core developers shouldn't be seen as, somehow judges or juries about what goes on in the network.
Well, I remember plenty of core developers defending the block size limit and, saying, hey, Bitcoin's not for coffee payments in Africa, right? Like that is, I think, a view that was taken that, Bitcoin is a final settlement layer, that you're going to build Lightning on top of, and that that'll be for payments. So I do think that there are, in their craftsmanship of the software, there are value judgments. I also think that developers are naturally interested in what is being offered by companies like Citria, right? Of looking at trust minimized, ways of doing things on top of Bitcoin that I think are, going to be open to lots of debate for the people who want to focus more on the monetary side of things versus kind of the utility aspect of blockchains.
Right, I agree. But Citria in this case, I think is they've been at the sort of forefront of this whole debate, right? Sort of perhaps needing Opportune to be larger, or perhaps benefiting from that. So obviously, if Opportune was removed entirely, they would have to pay a significant amount more for that data, or sorry, that if the inscriptions envelope window was closed, and then if the Opportune was removed, you don't think that would inhibit Citria from being useful?
So, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, they have to adapt to the Bitcoin protocol, not the reverse. And so I think that if they're again, if it was really about an opcode that had semantics to it of like verify this hash, or something like that, where okay, then they have a valid argument for why it should be of concern to the scripting layer of Bitcoin. But if it's really just about data storage, I don't think that Bitcoin should make data availability guarantees like an Ethereum would. So, for example, I think that all of the witness data should be prunable, and that you shouldn't have an expectation that there would be witness data older than 100 blocks, right? That it's funny that a lot of purist Bitcoiners would balk at that and say, we need to have full archival nodes, and if it doesn't have that, then it's not a full archival node. I disagree. I mean, I just don't think that you need it. Like, think about the scenarios where you need that. Things have gone so wrong that you need to roll the whole blockchain back, 100 blocks. I don't think that that's a reasonable criteria to have.
Okay, so we talked about developers and their expectations. So your thesis really here, I think, is still maybe lead me to water here. It's just that, because again, there has to be like a definition of like sort of who makes the rules here and like who's responding to who, right? So if a developer is using the current software over the rule, according to the current rule set, and then someone was to change that, it really has to be the developers or the users driving that. Right, it would have to be one of those camps sort of pushing for the change.
The miners as well, yeah.
Right, the miners could also push for the change. So in the case of here, the users, being sufficiently unhappy with the state of things, it sounds like you agree that is something that developers have a responsibility to respond to.
Okay, so the reason why we have not already seen this soft fork happen is because the cost of spam is very diffuse. Right, so everybody pays a little bit extra on their transactions, and that inhibits action against it. Right, it's only a small cost for me, so I don't care enough to actually want a soft fork. Right, and so I think that that'll continue to be the case until the cost increases. My fear is that the cost will never really increase to a point of pain where the users are really, going to push for this soft fork a lot more than they have historically. But it could also just get further inflamed by Twitter politics.
Right. Well, we've seen that road before. And I just think that the question here sort of becomes, right, like whose wants and needs gets dictated to. And so, there's a certain strain of Bitcoin philosophy, right, that it's just like this is how Bitcoin is developed. These are the rules. And so that they just should not be changed, right? And that there's this, philosophy that it is, as it was, right? And so this ability to add arbitrary data isn't going to go away, right? People are always going to find ways to do this. I guess the question is like, how do you make the argument that like, this is where I don't really understand how the Knots camp has gotten to this. Is like, how do you make the argument that there has been a sufficient amount of negative damage to whom in order for there to be some change here? Like who is particularly been disenfranchised, or like which part of the network is suffering immensely from what's going on. I think that's where it gets hard for me to understand, other than certain people being offended that there's certain, preferred nomenclature for describing Bitcoin gets more complicated. I don't know why that's something that the software has to accommodate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I approach it first from the perspective of like what is correct from a software engineering perspective, right? Which is, I think that it is correct that the software should make it as expensive as possible to spam, and then try to make it as cheap as possible to use for monetary purposes. I think that starting with that and then looking at, okay, well, how much, what cost difference are we looking at when there is spam versus not, right? So it's very hard to make the argument that this is a huge problem for Bitcoin because I should be able to send a transaction for 2 pennies and I'm having to spend 3 pennies, right? And so like, okay, it's 50% more expensive, but we're still talking about pennies. So it doesn't even, right, it doesn't register as being a problem. And I think that that's kind of why, even though from a software engineering perspective, it's perfectly feasible to clamp down on spam, that from a political perspective, it's impossible, or certainly, presented itself as a situation where basically, like if you look at the polling data, I've run some Twitter polls on this, the community is evenly split on this. And I've seen, because so if you start with that, then a soft fork's impossible, right? And so that's where I think that even though I'm right, I'm not like ready to fall on my sword here.
Well, I mean, I appreciate where you're coming from, right? I just think it's like you're invoking like a certain amount, like it's axiomatic, right? It's sort of like, okay, Bitcoin is money, therefore it should be, we're prioritizing for the money use case, and like, okay, so there are certain amount of transactions that aren't using that, and so therefore, perhaps in a perfect world, they should be mitigated, or there should be some attempts not to cater to them, or something, right? Maybe the ability for users and developers and whoever to coordinate to remove that. I think that's the point where it sort of becomes like, that is the real solution here that you would have to evoke, right? Is that users and developers would have to coordinate to stop this activity. And it just seems like evoking that process in any way seems somewhat undesirable. So even this idea of removing the op-return, well, now you're sort of evoking this sort of, you're invoking real politics, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I hope that people are persuaded by it, because I think that so the other part of it is that if the debate is just going to be about mempool policy and going in circles on that, then it will never resolve.
Yeah, the detour to mempool policy seems particularly unproductive because it distorts the actual issue, which is that, a debate about whether or not this has value to the actual mission and operation of the software. Is that your contention?
Yes. And that ultimately, like, okay, you can recognize that this would be a good soft fork to have, but that there's just nowhere near enough support for it to happen. And so I don't think that there's real pressure on the developers today to go try to push this soft fork through, signaling with miners. Like, I'm very skeptical that we would have enough miners on board with getting rid of a op-return. And it's also kind of a gating issue, right? Where I think I've heard some developers make this point, which is that now any changes have to be aligned with the incentives of miners. If we're going to use them as the signaling mechanism, which is not a vote, by the way, right? It's just trying to like figure out what's the probability of this being a successful soft fork. That if we don't have that signaling mechanism, because it's adverse to the interests of miners, then what do we have? We have Twitter hashtags.
Right. Yes. And I think the miners have pretty much shown that they're willing to, at least in the current fee environment where they're not making really any additional income off of fees, that they're willing to, essentially partake of the more exotic transactions that are out there, especially in the age when they're all public and publicly traded and need to boost their bottom lines. Though, of course, then you end up in sort of I think the knots and the, maybe one of the more creative aspects of the knots camp that, miners themselves have. I'm curious what you think about this, because this seems an undercurrent of the knots conversation that I find particularly interesting. It's this idea that miners, well, maybe scratch that. It's this idea that within economics, there are in fact multiple types of monetary signals, and that there can be because this idea that, the miners have fiat incentives, right? So there's I think Chris Guida is the architect of this idea. So I'll try to steel man it. It's this idea that there exists within economic incentives, good and bad incentives. The miners in this case, they want to take dollars today in ways that damage the protocol, because they are, a company structured in a certain way, and thus they have fiat incentives, which really kind of opens up the can of worms on, now within monetary theory, we have fiat incentives and Bitcoin incentives, and that the miners are perhaps not aligned with Bitcoin incentives. I don't know. I find it fascinating because essentially I feel like you're dealing with actually a core economic problem that a lot of people haven't speculated on. What's your take on this? Are there fiat incentives? Is that an actual quantifiable scientific thing?
No, I don't think so. Sorry to go against Chris's theory here, but I think the problem is that it's a negative externality on nodes, right? So nodes have no way of charging for the resource usage, and that the way that Bitcoin miners, what they put in blocks ultimately is a negative externality on nodes. And the only way to constrain that negative externality is to put in place resource usage limits. For example, the block size limit, signature operations count is also limited. And so that's how ultimately you get to say, okay, well, and this is the strongest argument for the spam, okay, is that the node operators have already underwritten the expense here. That 4 million weight units, they agreed to that. That's the negative externality.
Yeah, I wrote to somebody on Twitter the other day. I said, I really can't care about this. Like, how I could possibly care about this argument past the fact that the nodes have already opted into agreeing to provide the service. And then you're sort of now dealing with some node providers don't want to meet the service expectation of running a node.
Well, and then in return, I think it would be that now the miners don't want the node operators to amend the contract, which frankly, like, I think that is a totally fine thing to do, to say, hey, we had resource usage limits in place. We need to add some more because this negative externality, you guys found a little loophole here with Taproot.
I said to Bitcoin Mechanic a long time ago, back before this got acrimonious, and I said the most hilarious thing about this whole argument is that it's an immigration argument, and essentially, the node operators are the sort of indigenous, group that lives there, and then, sort of the added cost that they have from these itinerants who are sort of coming over the border, is essentially the problem. But my caveat to him at that time was, well, if you're biased towards hyper Bitcoinization and 8 billion people, coming into Bitcoin, well, then your target immigration population is 8 billion. And so your target immigration population is 8 billion, and yet you're deterring immigration. That doesn't really make sense to me, because you're sort of working against your own objectives.
Well, there's a difference between immigration and invasion. Okay. And
not to get too political. Now we're wading into current politics.
Yeah, no, but there, in terms of the intent of the newcomers, and so if they're using it for monetary purposes, that I think is real Bitcoin adoption. If they're using it to store JPEGs, then that's not monetary adoption, and that is substantively different and should not be catered to, should not be subsidized. Should be taxed,
right? And so now you're getting into sort of it's really a question of taxation and policy. Though to my point, it's I think it's
but now they have voting rights, and so now they're voting against the taxes that would go on them, or the regulations that would go on them, and so.
Right, but then what does it say about this idea that Bitcoin's existing users are sort of some in-group that has some sort of say? That's what I don't understand, right? Because there's nothing measuring the amount of time you've been in Bitcoin in order, nobody's. It's like you can't prove that these nodes have some sort of extended history of citizenship, dating back to anything, right? So there's no way to actually The idea that the set of nodes currently operating in Bitcoin have some sort of claim, as a constituent group, just seems bizarre.
I agree. I would not subscribe to that view. My view would be more about the rule set and kind of the precedent and the what kind of thresholds are needed to meet changes to be effectuated, and that the thresholds should be higher on things that, for example, 21 million Bitcoin, right? Obvious things like that. But when for example, like standardness, like I think standardness actually could be a consensus rule. But the thing is that, to your point, like not only does maintaining forward and backward compatibility is good from a philosophical perspective to respect users' rights, but it's also, in terms of future proofing going forward, that the more we limit with soft forks, the greater the probability of needing to do a hard fork in the future to fix something. And so that actually is the strongest, I think, argument ultimately against ever painting ourselves into a corner with soft forks.
Right. And it sort of gets to the point of I think it's reasonable to have a conversation of what would have been the threshold maybe to evoke some of these things. But, that's why I said earlier in this conversation, it feels like you have to go back to the halving, and the amount of activity that was actually taking place at that time, to sort of make an argument like that. And what we saw is that ultimately, these, different protocols, and I would argue that for a period of time, their impact on the network was quite substantial. I mean, if you were to look at ordinals versus something like Satoshi Dice, right? The ordinals, inscriptions, runes, boom, probably was 2x larger, and had a much larger constituent amount of groups kind of working on it. But you would have had to have seen some continued activity at that level at this point, I don't see how you would return to that. I mean, most people who bought ordinals at this point, if you go into the forums, they are down so badly in USD terms on their trades.
Right. Which kind of raises the question of why was there a sudden push to change op return limits in mempool relay policy? It kind of came out of the blue.
Well, I mean, I think the argument here is that, that they've made is that, miner decentralization, you want to basically make sure that every miner can compete for any transaction that's being mined, whereas that's not the case currently.
So, but that's always been true, right? That would be a consideration. But then to zoom in specifically on this issue, because, that could be an argument for removing standardness rules as well. Like, there's lots of things that you can delete.
Well, standardness rules are really bizarre. I mean, I don't know. Again, I find myself always confused because I learned everything backwards and I'm not a computer programmer. So when I have a novel thought on something, I often don't even know if it's very interesting until, years later after persistently asking about it. You remember my tangent on dissenting software, which is now sort of only, I feel like, being more validated. But the is standard thing, Satoshi eventually basically just, put in place some rule, about which, transaction types of which, he ordained. He sort of created a whitelist subset. And then, you think about, well, what was the alternative? Had Satoshi never done that, you perhaps could have seen an open market uptake of some of these, different transaction types. And maybe you would have seen organic market adoption and activation through something without, sort of the developer lead here. But, we now do have sort of the developers do seem to have this special claim, right, that they can do things within the name of safety on the network, and that inhibits the free market activities, right?
Right. I mean, but would you have preferred it if Satoshi had put that into consensus rules instead of the mempool, right? That ultimately, we have to go in one direction or the other. It is hand wavy to talk about kind of the safety and security of the system. I think it makes a lot more sense to talk about the economics of it, which is that we want to make it more expensive to spam. And that's kind of, in my mind, a much better argument. But from software engineering perspective, I don't know. They seem to not want to have an opinion.
Well, riddle me this, right? There's a lot of stuff about particularly the ordinals transactions and how there's a small number of Satoshis that are wrapped up in these transactions, right? But, wouldn't you see some sort of future in which, the ability to handle small amounts of sats on the main blockchain is beneficial simply because sats will be more valuable. So so this is also something that never really made sense to me, is there seems to be a particular contention about the increase in the UTXO set, particularly because the little ordinals denominations are so small. But then doesn't the software over time have to get better at individual UTXO handling? Isn't that like a forward direction, of the software that's positive?
Yeah, so I don't have any problem with that. To me, the problem is that if it is being subsidized by the fact that the inputs on Taproot are unconstrained in size, and so if clamping down on that caused there to be more tiny outputs, I don't think that's even an issue. And that at the end of the day, as long as you have a modern PC, it won't affect your ability to run a node.
So what do you think the best case scenario is here for knots? I mean, I've had a number of people on recently talking about this, just sort of saying like, okay, we have this, willingness of the users to create a new software with, policies that evoke their preferences in a far greater degree than we've seen before. Obviously there's consensus level issues with how long those things can be compatible, but assuming that those people are reasonably enough aware about those risks and then politically incentivized enough to run it, what are your reservations about what's happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, the only way knots can be successful is if Luke turns out to be right. And so,
turns out to be right about what?
The new Bitcoin Core version comes out. Terrible images get posted onto the blockchain. Elizabeth Warren goes on national television and says, we need to ban Bitcoin because there's terrible images on it. And then the Bitcoin price crashes to like $30. And everybody, says, hey, Luke was right all along. Elect him president and we'll all use knots and we'll delete the bad images. And then Bitcoin will go back to $100,000. They can only succeed by failure, right? By Bitcoin failing.
Right. Yeah. I think that was always what was weirdly perverse about that group is that, and I think that's been summed up pretty well, is that like they ultimately have to be somewhat short Bitcoin because they're essentially, once you go down the path of like, okay, well, this thing that is happening on Bitcoin can't happen, you end up in sort of an intellectual terrain where you're sort of more willing to increasingly sort of, in some sort of mental gymnastics to justify why your position is correct. And I just, I think that's my worry with the knots camp is always going to be that, what they're suggesting is happening, right, is that, these meta protocols and different crypto type activities are deterring users, creating legal risks and inhibiting Bitcoin success. But in their quest to stop those activities, they are actually going to create those risks themselves. And I think that's the irony that they miss in a great deal of circumstances.
The cost of spam is so low that you have to fabricate new costs. You have to imaginary costs like the political costs, right? So that it is a problem, and it's terrible because it metastasizes into FUD about Bitcoin. But that's I've tried to avoid that and just stick to the economic costs that I think are very real.
Well, yeah, it's not in your bones to FUD. You resist FUD at all costs. That's why I think we've seen that. Yeah, I don't know. I do think that there's some value to there being a dissenting implementation, right? Provided people want to investigate that, right? I do think that then you sort of have to get into like, well, is this particular implementation valuable and how long can it last? And I don't know. I sort of laid it out in the What Bitcoin Did episode where I said, essentially, what are the options with knots? It's either they create a competing meritocracy to the Bitcoin core process that, and stay in consensus, in which case that seems pretty valuable. I think the worst case scenario, they default to one of the earlier forms of governance in which there's, sort of a stronger central developer figure, which we've seen how that worked out, loosely with Gavin, and then pretty much absolutely with Satoshi, right, in terms of the levels of their monarchies. So I don't know. I don't really understand how knots doesn't or other implementations, right? There are people that we know who are talking about creating other implementations. So I don't understand how those implementations don't regress to one of the earlier types of, sort of Bitcoin software that I would argue from historical precedent don't seem to have actually lasted very long.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be great to essentially have that kind of. So, there'd be no problem if it was 10 different implementations with 10 different centralized decision makers, and then they have to come to consensus amongst each other, right? So, I think that's how the Ethereum world tries to do it. But de facto, um, I think there's like a power law distribution of 90% of the nodes are going to be from one particular implementation, and that the decisions that the Bitcoin core developers make are consequential. And so I think that that's the other part where, on one hand, we have to keep in mind that Bitcoin's decentralized and that anybody can contribute open source software, while also being realistic about the fact that it's kind of risky to gamble all your money on new software.
So I think when it comes to Bitcoin Core and how they proceed, it seems like they're going to issue, their software version. I guess, what would you say to folks who have hesitations about running that software?
You don't have to. I mean, but the other thing is that you can just. This is the insane part to me. You can just run dash blocks only and not have a mempool, and that's fine. It's you'll still receive your Bitcoin payments, right? Like it's still your Bitcoin's still going to cold storage. I would go further and say that the mempool, like out of the block size debate, I think there was an unbundling of the node operator versus the miner, and that we could see a third unbundling of the node operator, the mempool operator, and the miner, and that those three functionalities don't have to be on the same computer, and that there's no, and in fact in Ethereum they're much more separate like this. If that ends up being kind of the economically efficient outcome, I don't see that as centralized. Just like I don't see mining pools that have double-digit percentage market share is centralized.
Okay, a couple of things I want to pick on before we go, just to make sure we get to them. So, as a resident, of the South, of the southern states, there's this recent, sort of appeal for the users to see Bitcoin Core as some sort of, failing leftist institution that has been, deteriorated to the extent of academia and they're poisoning our food and our children, of course, so there's been this, why do you not think Bitcoin Core meets that? I think, it could be a potentially, a fair criticism if you hold that worldview. But why do you refuse to see Bitcoin Core in that way, or why do you see Bitcoin Core that way?
I don't see it in that way at all. I think that there's excellent code coming from the project as a whole, and so even if you disagree with literally the disagreement is over 2 lines of code, right? When it comes to op return and data carrier size. So if you look at kind of the totality of the code base, they have done amazing work at making the software more efficient so that it makes the cost of running a node lower. And so you can hold those two thoughts at the same time in your head that they're backpedaling on spam and that they should be doing more there, while also seeing them as very competent. As far as I know, who they voted for president has not affected the code quality. So yeah, I mean, I see it as pretty preposterous. But the other part too is that the whole point of open source is that you can look at the source code. You don't have to worry about who the developer was. And so, if there's specific things that people can point to of like, hey, this guy's an agent of the US government and he put a backdoor into Bitcoin Core and here it is. Okay, that's why we do open source. But to kind of just insult people and kind of just FUD, I don't like it. And I've also met lots of the Bitcoin Core developers, in person. They're normal people like you and I. They're very gifted at C++. They've got a variety of opinions, just as everyone else does in Bitcoin. Unfortunately, we're not a cult, right? So everybody's always disagreeing with each other.
And so I guess maybe the last thing we should probably cover is just this idea that seems pretty problematic that node operators are somehow liable for their content or liable for what they do relay on the mempool. This is sort of a new construct that has appeared over the last couple of weeks that I think is pretty troubling. It seems like the legal folks believe so as well. But there's this idea that, you can perhaps relay a transaction that was used for nefarious purposes, but if you relay or host a nefarious image, you're somehow more legally liable for that. I know you're a lawyer, but as an accountant and, actuary, leader of an audit committee, what are your thoughts on this distinction?
So this is something that, would come up in lobbying around Bitcoin mining, because it's basically the same argument as, criminals use Bitcoin. And that today, if the Treasury Department wanted to, they could just add the whole Bitcoin to the OFAC list and be done with it. And it would be illegal for any U.S. persons to use Bitcoin. Maybe it wouldn't hold up in court eventually, but the whole, if you look at the law, like the consequences for violating OFAC and, all sorts of other criminal activities, like those are, it's jail, right? And so, or stiff penalties. I wrote a tool that took all of the Bitcoin addresses from the OFAC list and then looked into the Bitcoin blockchain to see who is mining these OFAC transactions that are sanctioned. Some of them are US-based mining pools that everyone would be familiar with. And so, this is something that came up even, I spoke at the FBI symposium here on virtual currency crime, that the US government could ask Bitcoin miners to not mine OFAC sanctioned transactions and just leave them in the mempools, let Iran or North Korea mine those transactions, and then we'll build on top of it with the next block, right? But then basically the argument that you're making is that the transaction fee revenue should go to these sanctioned countries. And that's problematic as well, right? Because you're not supposed to give money to sanctioned countries. And so really, from a network perspective, I think where US policymakers have landed is that they're never going to apply any pressure to Bitcoin miners to dealing with OFAC addresses. In particular, because what the criminals and all the bad people do with the Bitcoin is that they try to send it to an exchange to cash it into fiat, right? Criminals are not long-term investors in Bitcoin. And so they're always trying to get to the exit. And to be able to freeze the money, the law enforcement is waiting for the Bitcoin to get sent to a regulated exchange where they can freeze the account. If the criminals never send the Bitcoin to the exchange, then they can't freeze the Bitcoin because Bitcoin, is not unseizable, but seizure resistant. So all that to say, I don't think that having undesirable, highly illegal, horrible images on the blockchain is a crossing of the Rubicon from a legal perspective, where it's like, oh, wow, the government did not have a pretext to ban Bitcoin 24 hours ago, but now they certainly can. And, it's completely changed the game.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think going down that road of evoking that is in itself, putting ammunition in the hands of people who would seek to do Bitcoin harm. So I think that goes to your point of view that I think some of the people in the, anti-core camp have essentially crossed over into needing to bet against Bitcoin for their intellectual positions to stand, which is not a friendly position to be in.
They're blackpilling themselves, becoming doomers. And it's really, that is against the Bitcoin ethos. So I don't think they have that going for them.
Right. Anything else we want to get to? I feel like we covered a lot.
No, I mean, we could debate MNAV if you want.
Well, the MNAVs are just a figment of our sentiment, right? It's just entirely sentiment.
It's all the feels. It's a feels-based economy that we're in now.
The MNAV one is interesting, right? Because hypothetically, the idea that you value a Bitcoin treasury company based on its assets, I was trying to think of an analog where that's also true. It's like, okay, well, so you evaluate like, you know, some sort of lumber company based on how much raw wood it has? Like, I don't know. I find I like the idea that MNAV seems to be, you know, it's a sentiment indicator, but I have a hard time feeling how it would be like an absolute figure, right? I mean, economics is, you know, deals in the fact that everything is subjective. So it seems like MNAV is itself an assertion that something has some sort of absolute value.
I think that it is an indicator for how much demand is there for going leverage long Bitcoin. And that, you know, if you look at margin trading at exchanges, sometimes everybody wants to go leverage long Bitcoin, and the exchanges, you know, they even run out of funds to lend out. And so that is, I think, what the MNAV is a signal of.
Right, but how does it have a pure absolute value, right? It doesn't, because if you're saying an MNAV of 1, it's like the company is worth the assets.
And there's no demand from investors for going leverage long.
I see.
Is what that is signaling in the abstract. Because
I get it with, like, you know, with Metaplanet, right? Like their MNAV compression, you know, they had a higher MNAV and then now they have a lower MNAV, but that's because they accreted that value to investors. So it's not a.
So that's definitely another dynamic. But I would assume, you know, and expect that their MNAV would increase if Bitcoin went to 200K, you know, before year end. That would cause there to be increased demand for going leverage long.
Right. I don't know how we worked that into our prior conversation, but
yeah, no, it's we got range on this podcast.
We can add just a slight quarrel, just like very just a very nuanced thing on, just tack it on the end there. Okay, like maybe we can say predictions. Do you think? Well, actually, I got a good end question. So do you think, since you see this software debate, you know, maybe this mempool debate going on, do you think there will be a fork that results in a coin split? I actually do, but I'm curious for your opinion.
No, I don't think so. I think that ultimately what's more likely is that you'll have people rage quit, right? So more like a Mike Hearn situation than a Craig Rice situation. And so that they'll throw their hands up and say, all right, Bitcoin's cooked. I'm done. I'm out of here. There's bad pictures on the blockchain. I can't be a part of this project anymore. And, you know, that's not the first time that's happened. People have rage quit Bitcoin before, and I think they will continue to do so. And it has to do with misaligned expectations, right? And so you could imagine things going in the opposite direction, right? If there's been people that have rage quit, like I mentioned earlier, Vitalik, right? That you know, the rules were not relaxed enough for him. What's going to cause a soft fork, hopefully not contentious at all, but, you know, just it's going to be the quantum computing and mitigating that issue. But maybe we can add some kind of anti-spam soft fork in there with it too.
Pierre, where can people follow you, learn more about all that you're doing for the Bitcoin sector?
At Bitcoin Pierre on X. Yeah, and my DMs are open if people have questions.
All right. Well, this has been a Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast. Of course, if you're on the internet listening there, smash that like and subscribe button. If you're in the UK or thinking about visiting, of course, the Digital Asset Summit just weeks away. Going to be a who's who of who's in Bitcoin and crypto attending. You can go to blockworks.co/events to find out more. And once again, this has been Supply Shock. We'll be back with you next time.